Hello everybody. Today I want to talk about the recently published white paper on citizenship, immigration and refugee protection. Okay, so the Minister of Home Affairs has recently released the white paper. White paper is part of the official legislation process. You have a green paper usually as a first step. White paper is then a broad policy framework or statement, and then the next step would be the first bill or the real start of the legislative process. Okay, so and I just want to comment on a couple of things. There has been a lot in the press, and I think I do think that some of the ideas in here are very useful and potentially should be commented positively on. However, I read the white paper now twice, and there's a lot of very interesting statements in there, but I do think it's very superficial, and I really struggle to find real policy suggestions we can as a public comment on until January, in particular on the immigration side. What is a bit disturbing for me is that the whole tone of it is very restrictive, very blaming. There seems the minister blames the bad foreigners and the press and the syndicates and everybody, but not really the Department of Home Affairs. There are one or two sentences in there where they acknowledge some mistakes or fault, but I think the whole tone, and it reflects with a lot of other statements the minister does, is that they see themselves a little bit as the victim of the crisis and not as the cause of the crisis. Okay, and that's really disturbing. I mean, and I want to make actually one or two examples here. In number 5, I mean, the minister really writes that Home Affairs is drowned by endless negative reports in the press, and that court cases take significant resources, and they're costly and they shouldn't be done, and the country can't afford it. And I find that quite strange. Firstly, we would be happy not to take Home Affairs to court if they would process permanent residences in 10 months or 11 months. I'm 100% sure not one foreign spouse of a South African citizen wants to take the Department of Home Affairs to court, but waiting 18 months is maybe not really conducive to the situation. So I find this weird, and then to blame the press for it is just strange for a minister to do, because in a democracy, I think the freedom of the press is, for me at least, a value I want to have defended, and I don't think a minister should complain about it. That's part of the job. So that's strange, and it continues. It continues to blame the foreigners. There are some acknowledgements that in some instances there are corrupt activities involving the Department of Home Affairs, which is just, it's strange. I wonder what the minister means in some instances. I mean, what about the other instances? I mean, fraudulent permanent residencies, they acknowledge that that's a problem. They acknowledge that there's a naturalization problem with the systems, etc. And I'm sure there are syndicates bringing corruption into the department, but I mean, it takes 2 people to tango, not just one. And this whole tone of the white paper is strange to me. That's maybe to that. There are some very good suggestions, so I do totally agree that the Department of Home Affairs needs a new IT system. They have tried to procure this for years, but they're forced to use the IT estate or the state IT provider, which is maybe not the best idea. I believe some private companies might be able to do this better, but then it's a budget problem, etc. So that's fair, right? Then there's a suggestion of an appeals board, or setting up a body dealing with the appeals, so moving the appeals away from the DG and the minister. Totally agree with that. I think it's not feasible that the DG and the minister is dealing with appeals. We're sitting at the moment with 8 or 9 months, which in itself is a legal problem. So do that. I think that makes perfect sense. They're also revisiting the immigration board again. That used to be in the first part of, or the first edition of the Immigration Act, and they want to revitalize that. I think that makes sense. But otherwise, I don't see many real suggestions in terms of immigration. So if you're a foreigner and you're looking for ideas what Home Affairs wants to do with immigration in the future, there's nothing in there. They refer to the critical skills list. Well, that's old news. And otherwise they blame foreigners for a lot of things. But what is missing is a clear statement that South Africa actually wants a functioning immigration system attracting highly skilled foreigners. It's missing in the whole white paper. There's nothing in there. It's more about how we can make it more restrictive, how we can close the borders, how we can tighten citizenship. And a lot of points are correct. And what they write about the refugee protection, that South Africa accepted the international conventions without exemptions, which is very unlike the international terms, they're 100% correct about that. So I'm really not blaming the whole white paper. I think there's thoroughly researched and there's a lot of, particularly on the refugee side, a lot of foreign legal work in the background being done. On the immigration side, and that's my specialty, I'm not a refugee lawyer at all, there's very little in there. And what is disturbing for me is that undertone. Instead of using the chance to make a positive statement, it's a very restrictive negative statement, really. And that's I find very disturbing. Plus, I don't know what to comment on because there's very little concrete suggestions in there. Yeah, I'm just going through my notes now. Yeah, I think the last comment I really want to make, and I've done this in the past as well, for me it's another attempt that a ministry wants to fix a problem which happened on the implementation side, on the legislation side. We have an implementation problem, and yes, with all due respect, we also maybe in certain parts have a legislative problem. So fix the legislation, it's fine. But the fundamental problems of our immigration system, what they're struggling with, is an implementation problem. It's not a legislation problem. And here again, we're trying to fix something on the legislation side, well, and actually, in fact, they probably should look at the implementation side, and there's very little in there. But admittingly, it's much easier for a minister to fix the legislation side than a department. And the management of the department, that's a much more difficult task, and quite frankly, sometimes potentially nearly impossible. So yeah, so in short, you can read the white paper. I don't think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I do think we will comment on it, on a few ideas on the immigration side to get at least some positivity in there. But that's pretty much it. So in short, I don't think it's really worth any news. Anyway, bye-bye.